Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sheila Marmon. I am the founder and CEO of Mirror Digital, and I am very excited to welcome you to Mirror Moments for our edition celebrating Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We have some amazing artists in the music and the business of music who are going to share with you a range of cultural insights and specifically how they support AAPI activism and how brand partners and marketers can work with these incredibly important diverse voices to tell stories and to amplify connections to the community. So I have Mia Folick here, who's an artist, and I'm going to let her introduce herself in just one second. And then I have Frankie Yaptonchai, who is an executive with Amazon Music and an artist as well. So we got the two for one punch there. Why don't we start off with you, Mia? If you can just tell us a little bit about your background, how you came to become a musician, and just how music speaks to who you are and the importance it has in your life.
Okay, thank you so much, Sheila. I'm happy to be here. Frankie was just talking about how many of these AAPI panels that have been happening recently, and I feel like I never get asked. So I feel so this is my first one. So we may have very different energies, and I have the energy of the newbie. But yeah, I think I don't think I am a musician. I grew up in California. I'm half Japanese and half Russian Italian, we think, not quite sure exactly what that background was. But I have been putting out music for about 5 or 6 years now. I released my first record on Interscope, and I am beginning the rollout for an EP, which will become my second record, and that's coming out on a label called Network. And I have one single out. It's called Old God, and I have a new single out next week. And so my background, I was a very nerdy kid who was interested in music and very interested in singing. I've always been a singer, but I never saw myself as a person who could be an artist or who could be a songwriter. And I think every time I'm asked to speak about this, I remember like, oh yeah, this is part of the reason why I couldn't see myself in that position, and that I was interested in singing, but I never really saw somebody like me, specifically who looked like me, reflecting that back to me. And so it was difficult for me to imagine myself in this position where I find myself today as a working musician and artist. But a lot of my musical background did come from the Buddhist church that I grew up going to. It was a Japanese Buddhist church in Orange County. And I played taiko there. I was a member of the choir. And I think just music was so a part of that culture in so many ways. And it's the way that I engaged with music as a kid. But eventually, I'm going to shorten this so I'm not talking forever. But
But we love it. So
good. I actually studied acting in college, and I graduated from college and found that, again, I couldn't really see myself. I struggled to figure out who I was. And I think other people also struggled to see me and to figure out who I was. And I found that even in college, I often got cast as like this kind of mythical being who comes from nowhere, or I got cast as an adopted child, or I got cast as, at one point I got cast as Dracula, who like doesn't really have parents, you know. So this idea of trying to cast me within a family seemed to be impossible. I think that a lot has changed since I was in college, and I do find it nice to look at, like, even in commercials, to see like, okay, they've created a way, or they've been able to see a way in which you can cast a family where not everybody looks exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
But I think when I was starting out as an actor, that's what I came up against a lot. And so
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I think I just didn't feel like I fit into the characters that people wanted me to play. And because of that, and because I had been so interested in music and was playing music in my free time all the time, I just decided to pivot into this
New
career that I was
space.
hoping to make in this space in which I could write my own music and I didn't
Yeah.
have to be written for. And through music, I've figured out who I was. When I started writing music, I did
So wait,
not.
Mia, you're getting all the meat. So let
Okay.
me
Okay.
pause you
No, well,
so
let's
that
pause.
we can introduce Frankie, and then we're gonna come back to all these themes. I think you hit on so many incredibly important ones. Is how do you tell your own story? Representation matters. Finding your space. Being willing to go on your journey. So we're going to cover all that in this conversation, and you gave us a sneak peek of where we're going, which is
Perfect.
all very exciting. So Frankie, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do.
No, thank you so much. And I definitely agree with so many of the different things that Mia has been, saying, like having an opportunity to, I love the part where it was, you casting yourself when you got to fit into certain molds. So a little bit about me. I'm Frankie Aptenshai, second generation Filipino American. I work for Amazon Music, where I do audience development and creative partnerships, specifically for our Asian and Asian American audience. So it's creating those spaces, and it's creating those opportunities to work in within our different verticals. So if it's working with live stream, if it's working on short films, music, programming, playlists, but making sure there's an API kind of presence, and kind of work to build equity within partnerships within our community. I think one of the big drivers of, like, working for a company is to make sure you come in with an authentic space, and working with the community in an authentic way to build with community and to build with the artists and the creators. So that's what I do, and that's kind of what, I started as an artist, and like everyone else, I was pushing the buttons, trying to figure out how to make space in the music world for myself. And I produced, I played in the band. I was with a label in Japan for several years, and also here in the States. And I think it was just I've kind of seen the artist experience from top to bottom. So being this opportunity now, where I can amplify, help out the creators, it's very rewarding, and something that I never thought it was going to be my, like, space for me to do this, but the opportunity to do this and help others in ways I couldn't when I was an artist is truly fulfilling. So happy APAM. Here we are. We have a whole conversation about this. So I'm here for
Happy
it. Let's
APAM.
happy
Yes.
APAM. One more day. Let's go.
Fabulous, fabulous. So, love hearing a little bit about how you guys got in the industry and got your start and some of the things that you find fulfilling. So why don't we dive into, oh, am I frozen? Good. Okay, great. Why don't we dive into what being, what APAM means to you? What does being AAPI mean to you? So it's interesting. I've been doing at Mirror Digital. We help Fortune 100 brands reach diverse audiences. So African American, Asian American, Latinx, and we're always like telling our brand partners, like, you need to be thinking more about the Asian American market and thinking harder about it. And it seems like there's been a groundswell in sort of the Asian American community coming together as a political force and a voice. And I would love to just hear your perspective on that, like in the past few years, and what it means to you personally. Mia, you want to go first?
Sure. Um, I think that it's interesting, I think, as a writer and a songwriter, to think about this, because I get asked about it all the time. And I I think that for me, I think people want this kind of easily digestible way of understanding how being Asian American affects my career. But I think there's like subtleties to it that are almost more interesting to me. And for me, a lot of it comes from this background of being raised in a Buddhist church, being raised in a Buddhist family, and how that culture and those philosophies are part of me. And I didn't really understand how much they were a part of me until I moved out of the house and into community with other people, and realizing like, oh, the primary religious and then it seeps into just like everyday philosophy in this country specifically feels very like Christians oriented, and that's a very different philosophy. And in my experience is a very like reward based system. And I think that I come from a Buddhism where there's more of a philosophy of like right living and good living, and there's not really like a reward based system. And I'm not saying that there aren't Christians who are Asian. And I think that's what we're all talking about here, is that like it's impossible for me to sit here and tell you what it's like to be an Asian American artist. I can only tell you what it's like to be me as an Asian American, as an artist. Yes. But and now I'm forgetting your entire question.
So it is just the question you just posed back to me in your own words, is not how, what's it like to be an Asian American artist, like not that you represent this monolith of Asian American artists, but what does being Asian American mean to you as a person and as an artist, and how does that impact your work? So that's, kind of flipping it, like it's very, it's very personal. And so that's kind of what we want to unpack a little bit.
Yeah, I'm curious what Frankie has to say.
Yeah, Frankie, what are your thoughts?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it's, coming from an immigrant family is just like, and you kind of have these perspectives of a dual identity growing up. Like you said, if it's church, if it's the community you're in, it's probably not going to be the same as everybody else's. It's going to be, even having mixed ethnicities, coming from a multi-generational family. So it means a lot. I mean, I guess as you get older, you embrace it a little bit more. As a kid, it's a little bit scary. It's like, you're like, wow, I'm a lot different. I grew up close by a military base where there wasn't too many like, Asian kids. So it was very much like, my last name is super long. The food I'm eating is way different. Like everything just a little bit, but as you get older, I'm like really proud and very like, I'm glad I had those experiences. So for me, it's like the shift, what I see now, it's awesome. Like artists are coming out like Saweetie and her, like we're half Filipino, half Black. Like they're like very much like embracing the dual identities, and they're like their cultural family. And I think that's amazing. Like I didn't see that growing up. So I'm like, wow, they're talking about like, kind of living in kind of a dual identity household. And movies like Shang-Chi with a Marvel star that's all Asian cast, it's incredible. And I didn't look at it as an Asian film. I looked at it as a good film, and it fit. And I think this normalizing artists, like you said, it's not an Asian and American artist, or like I said, I obviously work in a position where the artists and the creatives and the organizations I work with are to build equity in the community, but I don't speak for all of Asia. I can't determine like that's a pretty big place to really kind of say I'm the representative of it.
The majority of the world.
It's
Frankie, the representative.
I'm like, here I am, everybody, And you mentioned there's so many different languages and dialects and cultures and religions. It's very challenging to group, a large concentration of humans as, one acronym that seems to change every year, right? It's APAM, then it's AAPI. You know what I mean? Like it's one of the things, but I think in general, what's still like fulfilling and keeps me passionate with kind of having conversations is we're having these conversations and we're unpacking things about life. And, I think like everyone's story is going to be a bit different. So, I don't know. I guess that's for me. It's just refreshing. And I think is hitting a momentum where it's being normalized in media and entertainment and advertisements, seeing faces, I mean, we can go as deep as like how like women are perceived like as like it's always an Asian woman with an American, you know what I mean? Or like there's rarely an Asian man with like a non-Asian woman, you know what I mean? Like the advertising in general is like you can be with other people. You don't just have to be with like each other. Like it shows like what if you can be with different people? It's okay. So and now advertising is showing that, and it's normalized, and it's not just during APAM and not as stereotypical where it's like not harmful, but like it does perceive like only one box. So I think that what I'm seeing is a tremendous growth, a tremendous like upward progression, and honestly, it's like way overdue. So I'm happy to be part of this conversation and just put my hand up anytime someone needs me to jump into the conversation. Apparently, I like to talk, so turns out. So
Fabulous. Well, I mean, all these things that you're saying are so important. Making space for these conversations is critically important because, you just want to have the runway that you can start to talk about these things and explore the fact that everyone is going to have a different perspective, and we welcome all of them. Now, I want to go back to something that you both touched on a little bit and really dive in onto this issue of representation. So Mia, you talked about, feeling like you couldn't be in a certain space because you didn't see anyone that looked like you. Frankie, you talked a little bit about how things are changing with Shang-Chi and other more Asian representation in quote unquote mainstream media. But what does lack of representation, the challenges of this lack of representation posed in your own stories, in your own journeys, and how have you overcome them to really put yourself out there and make your mark?
I think that representation matters not only for people to be able to see themselves, but for other people to be able to see you as well. And I think that that's like, I come up against this because I am a singer-songwriter and I write emotional music. So, and sometimes it works to my advantage and sometimes it does not, but people are often like, oh yeah, she's just like Mitski. I'm like, okay, well, no, I'm not. I can see why you'd say that, but it doesn't really make sense to make that comparison if you're actually looking at the way that our music is written. And I think that part of what is frustrating about that is it's steering the conversation towards thinking about me and about us based on our perceived gender and based on how we look, and not based on the sonic quality of our music. And there are certain similarities. We are both very vulnerable in our music. And I think that's, if you're making that comparison, then yes. But I think that I think what frustrates me is like the lack of imagination from other people. So like, yes, I grew up not being able to see myself in media, and that was, I didn't realize that it was so much of a problem. And I worked through it on my own journey. I think that part of the reason that I love having these conversations is now I think that hopefully for younger people, it won't feel so much like it's their responsibility to figure out this on their own, as I think me and my generation, the generations that came before me, I think it was maybe a little bit more of a solo journey of figuring out what does it mean to be a bit othered in this country. But I think what does frustrate me is when I see the lack of imagination from people who are white and who are men in the industry that I work within, and that they are not challenging themselves. I'm not talking about everybody, but when I see people not challenging themselves to see outside of their specific community, it's very frustrating to me. But then you think that these people also grew up with the same media that I grew up with, where I couldn't see myself. And so they were also not seeing me. And I think that that's frustrating. So from both ends, it's frustrating. And also, I think that diversity is always better when there's diversity of the way that people look and the way that people think and the family cultures that they grew up with, the way that they approach a problem, the way that they approach an issue when it's different, we work better collectively. So I know I said a million different things, but I think that I think that
all good
often,
things.
yeah, often, like, especially when I first started out in music, it felt like a very homogenous space, and I think it's becoming less and less that way. And that's very exciting to me. I love going and seeing shows and seeing a young, diverse audience, and it just makes me really excited for the new generations, and why it's so important for people like Frankie to be doing what they're doing. Like, I really see it making a difference, even just over the past few years in the music spaces that I'm in.
I mean, I love that word you said, you were feeling othered, and, pushing up against that, pushing up against those limited perceptions and really widening the lens of how people see you is work that we all do as people who've been othered in this country. So I think, I totally hear you and I feel you. Frankie, please share your thoughts.
Absolutely.
Representation.
Yeah, and lack of creativity. I like that. The lack of imagination. That lack. Then to me, that's the truth. I think that's the opposition, even on the other side too. There may be in positions of power when kind of explaining kind of the value of like not trying to just present like you should find value in these artists or these communities because they're Asian. It's because the music's good and the writing's good and the organizations are good. That's kind of like the challenges, right? It's an understanding like, can we do this outside of APM, the Lunar New Year's, the bigger holidays? Can we like actually invest? And it's weird because there's always going to be a perception, right, of how you grew up and visually what you see. Like me mentioned, just because it looks like something doesn't mean it's the same. It's like we may play the same kind of music or look kind of the same, but it's not the same music. It's completely different writing, completely different narrative, a completely different story. So it's hard to group. But then unconsciously, people will do that, unfortunately. I think it's just part of like you kind of see, or this sound kind of sounds like this. And I'm like, I don't really think it does. I think there's similarities in maybe background and maybe like a perception of what visually you may see, but conceptually it's actually very different. And I think those are the challenges. I mean, I think with like Asian like led roles, there's still going to be perception of for men. They probably maybe it's a martial arts thing, and if it's women, it's more subjective, and you're just like or submissive. And you're like, well, there's actually a lot of really bold actresses that are like are in the lead, and there's and unfortunately those were the obstacles. So if we're like identifying what were the obstacles, it's years and years of perception that are negatively stereotyped and unfortunately biases that are just unconscious in people's minds. But on the positive side, I do feel like there's a lot of work being done, and there's a lot of things being unpacked. Even on the professional development level, there's organizations that are doing like they're trying to develop producers, female, male, like Asian, like whatever. Like there's camps, there's Grammy camp for like I worked on something with the Pacific Bridge Arts Foundation, and they are doing like an Asian American like Grammy camp. So they're working with the brands, and like that wasn't something that was available. I thought it was beautiful. The Asian American Collective, they're an amazing group. They bring together Asian American industry professionals to build community and build space and share resources, share networks, to amplify each other's projects, even if it's Black creators, Latin creators, whoever is creators. But the people behind it, they understand the value of everybody, and I think that like there is spaces where there is going to be a new wave of like Asian and Asian American producers and executives that like maybe wasn't as prevalent in the last 15 years. But I think that in the next five, I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot more of these people kind of like making some noise and really putting on for the community and sharing those value pieces. So I think the imagination will expand with the companies for a lot of them, hopefully, and in media and it'll transcend with I think a better product for everybody.
I love this. I think that I think this is one of those teachable moments or one of the golden nuggets from the conversation. You both talked about how the lack of imagination is hindering people from kind of realizing their best work and doing their best work in the Asian community and tapping into the community authentically. And I think this is something that our clients can really learn from. How do you overcome unconscious biases and prejudice? How do you move beyond stereotypical roles and, genres? And how do you really think about coming up against the fact that this is a community that has been othered like so many other communities of color, and really widen the lens to see that there's so many ways to show up and to tell stories? And I want to go into that storytelling a bit, because Mia, you said one of the things that frustrated you is that you're being compared to an artist that really, people are looking at the most salient characteristics. You're both women, you're both from the AAPI diaspora, and so they're going to kind of lump you together. But the fact that your stories are different is where we really need to be focused on, because it's those stories that really have the richness for helping us understand one another on a human level. So if I could, if you guys could talk a little bit about how your storytelling in your art, kind of spills into, activism and kind of pushing into these new frontiers, that would be wonderful. Mia, you want to start? Oh, there you go.
And I just do want to say that I love Mitski. The comparison is very flattering, if problematic, but I think that and one thing I will say is that I'd like to be doing a lot more in this space, and like those two organizations that you mentioned, Frankie, I'd love to hear more about them. So if you wanted to connect us on the side, I'd love to hear more about those two organizations that you were talking about. But I think that another thing that I want to mention that kind of relates to this is that part of what I struggle to see in media, because it's so rare, is the story of an Asian American person who is struggling in some way in their life, like a personal struggle. I'm thinking about, I'm forgetting the name of the show, but Zoe Chow plays a character. I don't know if either of you remember this, in Modern Love, I believe. But anyway, she plays a character with a drinking problem. And I think that that's so rarely seen for a character who is Asian American, who is a woman, who is young. And it's such a common theme. And I think often when I'm reading about Asian Americans, like a common topic that comes up is mental health in the Asian American community. And I think that one thing that I'm really interested in learning more about and becoming more involved in, because I think it's become kind of this natural progression of where my career has gone, is that I happen to be an Asian American, and I happen to be a person who sings about my struggles a lot, about very personal struggles. It's in the music, and that's, I think, the oftentimes what where I find people connecting with me on this level of like, thank you for telling this story. This is my story, and I hadn't really seen it from somebody who looked like me, or I relate to you in this way because I felt ashamed in a similar way. And maybe they feel like we come from the same family, even if maybe we did not. But I think that I didn't have that as a kid. And I think that it's been so cool for me and very gratifying to be able to be that person for other people younger than me, people older than me. And that's definitely, for me, somewhere where I'd like to become more involved in that, and like in this space of helping people tell their stories. And I think I'm not quite there yet, but I think that that's where I'd like to go, of that sort of kind of storytelling type of activism.
I love it. I mean, there's this saying like the personal is political, and you just, hit the nail on the head by, sharing your stories with other people and then being able to see themselves, and it's an empowering thing. So once you recognize there can be kind of a call to action and a call to power to affect change, like how do your stories make people feel like, hey, they're okay, and then where do they go from there? It turns into action often. So I think that's amazing. Frankie, what are your thoughts on this storytelling and really leaning into storytellings as a way to to harness power and to move people to action?
Absolutely. I feel like there's such a call to action in the community the last few years for a lot of unfortunate bad reasons, right? I mean, there were shootings, there was the kind of like the influx of Asian hate crimes, there was COVID in Southeast Asia that was really like taking a toll on like countries with limited resources, and then it comes back to, like I said, back to stateside where there's a lot of just like I don't know, there's just a lot of negativity. Kind of was very stigma towards it, and I think a lot of artists spoke up. The community, both in entertainment, a lot of companies spoke up too. We work, for like working with organizations that are already kind of doing the work in the community, like a Hate is a Virus, or Stop Asian Hate, or Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Like those are phenomenal groups that have been doing this work for years. And I think that like a lot of the artists got behind it and the creative community got behind it because they felt like their voices were amplified and they found a place that they can kind of drive change. And what I saw how those artists, storytellers advocated for those organizations and they raised, I mean, just a very large sum of money to help community efforts and shows how the community can activate together for resources. So I don't know if that answers the question directly, but I feel like it puts into perspective where like the power of the creators and the power of like the writers combined with community leaders and builders can really make a change. And really like the activism shows in that. I think that's the whole point of it, right? It's like to drive a positive change by having your voice uplifted, if it's from a company or if it's from an artist. So that's kind of what I've seen. And I've definitely seen this new kind of this new generation really activate in a meaningful way. So that's kind of what I've seen. And I honestly feel like with every new kind of challenge that is, if it's either representation or if it's something as critical as literally people's lives, most important part of things, or to build communities, it's like there is, activism that can be done so much from this like the words of the creators. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think that's the reason why people are doing music, right? Is to actually do something good.
Absolutely. And Frankie, I think being in the space and you're in it so organically, both of you, helping people who are outside kind of see what's happening, just the connections that you talked about, how artists are using their stories to help support organizations who are empowering Asian American communities and that whole cycle. People who are not part of the community may not even be aware that this is happening. So as people think about, what is important when I speak to AAPI communities, especially when you have a brand or a marketer or someone trying to, at the end of the day, they're selling products. So how do you show up with respect, with love, with authenticity, all those things that really show that you care about these communities is so important. So I think understanding that trend and that wave that's happening is so important. So Asian American, we in the United States, I always like to remind people of this, have grouped a bunch of different types of people together under this banner. So we've got so many different countries and languages and religions, culture, food, all these things. And there's still, even with that diversity, seems to be a foreignization of Asian Americans and always thinking that, you're from someone else, from somewhere else. So how does that dynamic show up in the sense that you have your pride in your country of origin, it's a very specific culture, it's a very specific history, and then people always second guessing your Americanness. Like it's like you have this tension, and I would just love to kind of tease that out a little bit. Something that we know that I think still is a thing. Might tell me, Sheila, no, it's no longer a thing, and I'll be like, yay, finally. But maybe it's still a thing. Please let me know.
Definitely still a thing. And I will say that I think I get asked a lot less now in the space that I work in now. When I was working at a restaurant, I got asked at least once a day where I was from. And that conversation would always go, "Where are you from?" And I'd say, "I'm from Orange County." And they'd say, "No, originally." I'm like, "No, originally. I was I was born in Los Angeles, and then my family moved to Orange County." And then I like wouldn't give it to them easily. And then eventually I'd be like, "I think what you're asking, I think you want to know what ethnicity I am." And it would literally happen every day. It happens to me much less. I guess I don't know what it is. I think I think also when you're working in a service industry in a service position, people feel like they can ask you anything about you. So I will say I feel lucky that I don't get asked that as often anymore, but I do think that people are getting asked that every day. And I think for me, because I grew up, my mom is from California. Her father is from Japan, but moved to California when he was in his 20s. And her mother was actually born in California. So in so many ways, I am so Americanized. And I'm not even the first generation to be Americanized. My mother is Americanized. And also my mom, she and her family before my mom was born were in an internment camp. So their reaction to that when they returned to their home was to assimilate, to speak English in the house and to try to assimilate as much as possible. So I think by the time I was born, I feel like I feel very culturally linked to the Japanese Buddhist community. We were very involved in that community. My family was also very involved in the Japanese American community and the JCCC here in Los Angeles, and JANM, the National Museum.
Can you tell us what JCCC stands
The
for?
Japanese American Community and Culture Center in Little Tokyo. But I think in many ways, and I don't, it's hard for me. I think it's hard for me to know how other people perceive me, but I feel like I've been operating in white spaces my whole life. And so I think that I have a very specific experience as an Asian American who people are like, what is she Asian? What's, I think that's a very different kind of experience than somebody who goes through life where constantly being perceived as Asian. I think the question mark is a little bit different than like, oh, that's an Asian person. But people look at me and they're like, what are you? What's going on there? But I think that for me, that has led to this feeling that I think I still am figuring out now, of who am I? Where do I belong? How much do I belong in this space where nobody looks like me, where I feel like I belong? Then every once in a while, somebody says something to me that others me. Like I've similar things. I think this is the most specific one, but like I remember one of my friends in high school describing me as she's half Japanese and half normal. And I was like, oh, okay, so I'm half weird and half normal. Like, what does that mean? And that has been my specific experience, is this like, oh, I felt like I belonged, but then you did something that made me feel like I don't belong. And I think that has been, it seeps into my music in ways that sometimes I don't even realize until after, when I'm listening back to it. And also through making music now for I have a few years under my belt. I think when I first started out, I couldn't see the whole picture as much. But now that I've written a larger body of work, I'm like, oh, I've been trying to find myself and my place, and music has been the way that I've chosen to do that. But I do think that a lot of it has to do with my cultural background in a way that I did not know while it was happening. And I do think that has to do with my age and when I grew up. I'm 32, so I think I grew up in a time where people weren't talking about this as much, and maybe my experience would be different if I was growing up now. But yeah, I think that was my very long-winded way of saying that there is a way in which lumping Asian Americans together creates, I think it almost creates this like inner tension, because I would never assume to understand the life experience of like the child of immigrants, or the life experience of somebody who grew up in another country and then moved here for college. Like that's a very different experience from me. And I think that what is nice about these conversations is finding a way to say, like, yes, we have these differences, and yes, they're lumping us all together, even though we're very, very different culturally. I think I read that Asian Americans have like the most disparate economic background of any like ethnic group in America. So there's this huge wide gap between people. But what is cool about these conversations is that we're able to be like, yes, we are very different. Our experiences are very different, but we can still band together and help each other and share resources, like Frankie was saying. But yeah, I think sometimes it's hard for me to talk about it because I'm like, my experience is so different, and it's very specific. And in many ways, I have been able to like pass in white spaces, or maybe I haven't, and I just thought I could. Like I know, but I do feel like I have. It's a different experience when I look kind of ambiguous and people don't quite know what I am.
We
And
had
do
one of
I.
these we had one of these conversations, one of these mirror moments conversations, and the title was, what are you, and other annoying questions that you get. It's like all about, this kind of mix of culture and ethnicity and identity. So Frankie, please tell us your thoughts on sort of this tension between your ethnic national identity and being Asian American, or is there a tension? What's your experience?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think there's always going to be a tension, right? When you group like someone from India is way different than someone from Hawaii. I promise you this, you know? And I think so there's two perspectives of it. If it's like how a company perceives it, it could be negative, right? Because then it's like, here's this month or here's this kind of like celebration, and this is how all you should act collectively. This is like the what we know of if it's food, if it's branding, if it's, it's all really different. There's a lot of different languages. There's a lot of different like religious beliefs, which really separate kind of like different how people are want to be perceived. So yeah, I think there definitely is like some tension because it's still very much grouped together. Anytime you just kind of consolidate and just group a whole entire kind of community that have so much different valuable life experiences, stories, tradition, values, it's going to be some challenges. Um, and for myself personally, I most people, it's interesting. There is like certain characteristics they know I'm some sort of Asian, so that's usually just by my last name and just the way I look. There is some sort of like identification. I have some sort of Asian in me as far as background. So do I feel like I have to explain it? I don't mind. Personally, it's never really been a big deal. I'm like, if you want to learn about a second generation Filipino, it's pretty much the same. Like, so what you grew up, I grew up on, Ninja Turtles and X-Men too, man. So I don't know. Like, I listen to a lot of Wu-Tang. Like, what do you want me to? So, so,
It's about as
uh,
American as it gets right there.
pretty American, right? Oh yeah, I was like, I can tell you about, the '90s, and the '80s. Great, those are great times. So I guess there's that, and I used to kind of get defensive about it, like, where y'all from? And I'm like, well, my parents are actually, from the Philippines, and they're first, this is the first generation. My mom and dad ended up going to school out here, which gave me ample opportunity to pursue the things that like and to bring family over. So I think, there is never like for me, I never really I know it's coming from a place of like a conversation starter. Like I'm trying to get to know you personally and build rapport. And sometimes like I said, I'm not giving anybody a pass or an excuse, but it is that's the main thing. They're like, oh, something is clearly different in the room. Maybe we should learn about it before I say something crazy. And right, like, hey man, like happy Chinese New Year, and I'm like, I'm not Chinese, man, like, so like so maybe that's the reason why they try to like, make sure that like they have all information is present. I'm like, thanks, and I'll happily give you the breakdown of what you want to know, but it's gonna be very similar to you. I think given that trust with people is what I'm trying to build, where it's like it's okay to like tell about our stories. It's okay to like be multi-generational. But yeah, it does breed tension. That's it. I don't speak on behalf of the entire Asian race. I don't speak on behalf of even a portion of people, but I can speak for myself and like a lot of people like myself who were this kind of Americanized, like you mentioned, like we just got to be in a lot of different spaces. Um, it is sometimes interesting, and you kind of hear some things that are maybe not as I don't know, it doesn't feel so good. I guess to say like it's not the most sometimes progressive conversations, and there is some things that are backwards in people's perceptions. But that's part of like the journey, and that's kind of what we're always going to have to go through and as we build. But I will say it's currently going in the right direction for at least some peace, at least some more harmony between the communities. But I think there's still a long way when we start segmenting groups and lumping them together. I think that's my only call out was there's room for improvement to really kind of like give every community. If the goal of a company is essentially to highlight or amplify a community, actually do it, and then take the
Give
time
every
to do it.
community their shine.
Give
Everybody
them
needs
their
shine.
right. It's like if that's truly the goal, you may have some challenges, or you could see some tension grouping it all together, and that's what I'm trying to do as well, is to make sure we can tell this authentic storytelling, but then also identify like if there is like blind spots and things that we're missing. How do we do better, and how can we do better where it's a meaningful time for them? It doesn't have to be May all the time. It doesn't have to be. Promise. A lot of stuff happens the
Doesn't have to be
other
May.
months.
Lots of other months, right?
Lots of other months in the year. I promise you this. So yeah, thank you.
Well, as we tell our brand partners, there are lots of other months beyond May and ways to think about connecting with this incredibly rich and diverse community. We are wrapping up on time, so I just wanted to open up the chat ways for anyone to ask any questions to our panelists. Let's see, looking at our Q&A here. How do you use art to tell culturally specific stories? So if we think about, I think this has bubbled up in conversation over the course of the last 50 minutes, but when you are there times when you're intentional about it? Like, okay, this is where my Asian American identity is going to go on blast, and this is how I'm going to do it. So like, what are some of those platforms or methods that you might think about? Frankie, you've worked with
Yeah.
an interesting one recently, so I'd love to hear, tell everybody about what you've been up to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like you're right. Sometimes there is like this is a very intentional story of like life, and I think a couple artists that can come to mind. Ruby Ibarra, she's Filipino American. She has an amazing story, and a lot of her music, she'll do it in mixed Tagalog and in English sometimes. She'll talk about like her upbringing with her family and immigration story. Very intentional. We just did a film with Luna Lee in '88 Rising, and then about her Korean, Canadian heritage, and we just sort of filmed that. And basically, her coming to LA and kind of go walking through this experience of like playing music, not only her playing music, but like creating a traditional Korean garment to like wear. And, I think that was super cool. I should kind of explore a little bit more of that and kind of saying, hey, like I'm learning more about my identity and my past. So I think like telling those stories that are very intentional, like I said, this is very much like a story about, an Asian experience that's very specific. I think that's super cool. So we've been working on a few things like that for Amazon Music. It's also on Prime Video. We had a big release event in LA yesterday, and it was great. Like to see everyone to come out to see that story and have Luna come out. It's amazing. So I think there's a lot of great storytellers, and it is appropriate at any time. I think you should be telling. I think that's what makes. I think any artist that I grew up on to help me identify with them is to learn about their culture. If it
Mm-hmm.
was hip hop, it was R&B. If it was rock, it was like, wow, like I know this person's story. Like they
Mm-hmm.
don't know me, but I know their story, and it can be from a whole other life I never lived, or it can be for something that I can relate to. If it's family, if it's like religion, if it's like emotions, like wow, this person's like me. So I think having an intentional Asian story, like it's always like to me very much like I love it. I think that's what's gonna separate it, like the artist to really connecting with people. So.
Mia, do you have anything you want to add on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited to see that on Luna Lee. And I mean, I think I'm seeing a lot more stories specific. I mean, I think it's just people are telling their stories, and I think it's just about platforms and getting those stories seen on broader platforms because Asian Americans are making movies and videos and music, and it's already happening because they're making stories about themselves, about like personal stories about themselves and about the people in their community. And it's just about getting people to see it because the content is already out there. Personally, I think I I on my first record pretty specifically wanted to include my heritage, specifically my Japanese heritage, and a lot of a lot of that went into the visuals for the record. And um, my parents are actually on the record cover, so you can see their faces. And I think there's something about that for me was this like all the past, present, and the future coming together. We're all three of us looking in the same direction. And that was what we were aiming for, this kind of like visual metaphor of this past and the present. Not that my parents are the past, but like my mom is still alive and she continues to live. So it's just not the past, but this like multi generations looking forward together towards the future. But I think there's a lot. I mean, there's so many other people making much more interesting, like cultural stories. I think that my project, in so many ways, is very much like a diary and very personal to me. But but I love seeing these stories that other people are making that are including their culture in ways that, yeah, I think that I didn't grow up seeing as much. So I really appreciate the work that Frankie's doing, and I'm so interested in seeing these two documentaries you're talking about.
Well, you guys, thank you for this amazing time together. It's been an hour, which is like it feels like it's flown by like that. So, Mia and Frankie, I really want to thank you so much for sharing your insights, sharing yourselves, sharing your stories with all of us here at Mirror Digital. And this is a wrap of episode 10, Mirror Moments, our Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month edition. But we know we can move beyond May, so next month we'll be in a different month. And I just want to say I appreciate you both and look forward to being in touch.